If you're planning a trip to Europe in 2025, you can walk in the footsteps of the Anzacs. Our Western Front Explorer Tour spends 4 days exploring all the Australian battlefields from the First World War in the Somme, the Ypres Salient and Flanders. This is the only Australian tour that begins and ends in Paris, so it's a really great way to see those famous battlefields. Now, the Western Front Explorer Tour departs weekly between April and November, and it includes accommodation in the heart of the battlefields, deluxe transportation, and a range of extras that you only get on a Matt McLachlan tour. And like all our tours, you'll be escorted by one of our expert historians who will bring the story of the Anzacs to life. This itinerary has been personally designed by me, and all the historians are my friends and colleagues, and I've handpicked them to lead these tours. This really is a brilliant way to see the battlefields. It's the 4-day Explorer Tour, departing weekly from Paris, and for more information, you can visit battlefields.com.au.
Bada, bada boom, sold.
Huh?
Just sold my car on Carvana. Dropping it off and getting paid today.
Already?
What, you still haven't sold yours? You told me about it months ago.
Is
the offer good?
Oh, the offer's great.
Don't have another car yet?
I could trade it in for this car I love.
Come on, what are we waiting for?
You're right.
Let's go.
Whether you're looking to sell your car right now or just whenever feels right, go to Carvana.com and sell your car the convenient way. Terms and conditions apply.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. Do you ever find yourself playing the budgeting game? Well, with the Name Your Price tool from Progressive, you can find options that fit your budget and potentially lower your bills. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Price and coverage match limited by state law. Not available in all states.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot. We charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
A Living History production.
This is the Living History Podcast, broadcasting live across the airwaves.
Hello and welcome to another episode of Living History. Today we're going to be talking about, well, not really history per se, but the writing of military history, which is going to be something very exciting because my guest has a brand new book out. I've got to say, I've really been enjoying it. I've got it here. It's Beyond the Broken Years, Australian Military History in 1,000 Books, written by Peter Stanley. And Peter, thank you so much for coming on the show to discuss this new book.
Matt, it's a great pleasure. Hello.
And thank you also. That I would think that if, in 1,000 Australian military history books, that my small contribution would be lucky to be included. But I do appreciate that I got a mention in there as well. Three mentions, in fact. You're right. All of my books got in there, which was quite a novel surprise, I must say. Let's start at the beginning. Tell us about this. This is not a military history book, but it's a book about Australians writing military history. So it's a novel idea. Something quite unexpected, but I found it absolutely engaging. I really enjoyed it. Just tell us a little bit about what inspired you to put this book together.
Oh, well, that's easy, Matt. The Broken Years, Bill Gamage's book of 1974, inspired me, literally. I realised last year that it's 50 years, last April as it turned out, but 1974 was the year The Broken Years was published. And The Broken Years completely transformed the way Australians wrote about military history. And I thought our field has been absolutely inundated with books for the last 50 years, completely different to the way it used to be, the way it was before The Broken Years. So I took The Broken Years as a kind of a marker of the last 50 years in Australian military history. And I've looked at what people have written and what they haven't written and what they've said, and basically tried to define or describe a subject that we take for granted because we work in it all the time. We read it, we do it, but we don't often think about the big picture. So it's a book of 50 chapters that looks at 50 aspects of the way Australians do military history.
Well, let's start with that book, The Broken Years, because I think just about anyone who's read anything about Australian military history owes a great debt to Bill Gamage and the work that he did in The Broken Years. Just to start off, why don't you give us your quick assessment of what that book is about and why it was so important?
Yeah, its subtitle is Australian Soldiers in the Great War, and you would have thought that subject would have been beaten to death by Charles Bean and the battalion histories. But what Bill did was, as a young PhD, he walked into the War Memorial and he asked to see the huge collection of letters and diaries that we've used all the time. We everybody who does Australian military history now uses those sources. But in 1970, when he embarked on his PhD, although the sources were there, no one had used them. So the thing that Bill did was to basically break open this Pandora's box of Australian military history sources, which were quite different to the sorts of sources that had been used before that. Military history before that had been written by people like Charles Bean and the battalion historians, but hardly anybody else. And a young ANU PhD coming along was an animal that had never been seen in that forest before. So, we take it for granted now, but actually Bill was the first to explore the war, their experience of war in their own words, quoting from them and introducing us to those men. It's the sort of thing that you and I have done since as a matter of course, but it was really revolutionary in 1974.
Well, that's the thing that struck me when I first started reading the book, Peter, is military history is so ingrained in our Australian culture now, and any bookshop you walk into, there's a huge section talking all about Australia's military history. It feels ubiquitous to us that it's just part of the story. But 50 years ago is relatively recently when we think it's been 110 odd years since the First World War and so much has happened. It was remarkable to me reading the book to discover how relatively recently it was that Australians started engaging so strongly with the military history and writing about it and researching in a way that, as you say, we now take for granted.
Yeah. There was a couple of standouts before 1974. I've been going for years saying that the Australians ignored POWs, and that's of the Second World War, POWs of the Japanese. And I realised that wasn't true because three of the big sellers in the 1940s and 50s were POW memoirs. So they sold tens of thousands of copies. And then in 1956, the war correspondent Alan Moorhead published a book called Gallipoli, which was a blockbuster of its time as well. But they are very much exceptions to the general apathy. I think it's because everybody had grown up on family stories of the war. They'd seen Charles Bean's volumes. They knew about the Second World War volumes, and they knew about battalion histories. But battalion histories and unit histories weren't read by ordinary people, people in the street. They were read by former members of those units. So I think Australians basically took their military history for granted, and it hadn't entered history in the sense of it that it has now, where people are interested in stories that they've only got a glimmer of and they're eager to know. That wasn't the case before then.
Well, it reminds me, Peter, that of something that I say that we all know about Anzac Day is that we take it for granted that Anzac Day is now this popular, engaging community event. But it hasn't always been the case. It's been quite cyclical that at various times in our history, Anzac Day was not commemorated in large numbers at all. And this sounds like the same thing to me. This sounds to me the same sort of thing. And perhaps it's for that reason that we had this very strong oral history. Everyone grew up with a dad or a granddad telling old stories about the war. And so it wasn't what you were going to turn to for your bedtime reading. Is that a fair assessment of the situation prior to the Broken Years coming out?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, Vietnam is the shadow over this. Carolyn Holbrook did a terrific book, Anzac, an Unauthorized Biography, a few years ago. And she traces, as you say, the boom and bust of Anzac. And I mean, I can remember Anzac Day at the War Memorial in 1975, where it wasn't large enough to move out of the cloisters. It was really quite tiny. And I think that's a reflection of the way the Vietnam War divided and embittered Australian society. But of course, as you say, that changed. And these two things are connected, that the revival in Australian military history is paralleled by the growing interest in Anzac Day. And it may change again. We don't really know. We shouldn't assume that what we're familiar with is going to stay that way forever.
So you've written a number of outstanding military history books yourself. You're obviously a very esteemed historian who knows a lot of these people working in the military history space. You were influenced by the broken years. So what was it that made for you that leap to then say, okay, there's a really interesting book here about how we've written about our military history?
Well, the background story to this is that I'd written a memoir of my professional life as an historian, and I offered it to New South, and New South said, I don't think so, even though a previous publisher at New South had encouraged the book. But, okay, I said, and I have this philosophy that if you get knocked back, you get straight back on the horse. And so I said, okay, if you don't want the memoir, what about this for an idea? And I basically, because a lot of the people I'd written about in the memoir were those historians who'd influenced me or who I'd admired or whose work I'd read. And I thought, hang on, there's generations passing here, and we really need to understand where not just the military history that we write, but how we've written military history. So I turned the knockback into another offer, and fortunately, this time New South saw sense, and I'm really pleased with the job they've done.
It's the subhead says that it's 1,000 books, but I suspect there were many more books that you came across in your research. I mean, my broad question to you is what's your opinion about the state of Australian military history and our writing about it and its place in Australia in 2024?
Yeah, there were more than 1,000 books. I compiled a bibliography as I went. I got to 1,300 and then I just gave up. And I knocked off whole categories of books. I didn't do technical books, books about aircraft or vehicles. I didn't do art books. I didn't do children's books. You could probably double the 1,000, which is a sign of just how fertile that the field has become since the floodgates opened. 1974 might be a little early because if you think back at the landmarks, Lloyd Robson's the first IAF, that's 1970. Patsy Adams Smith's the Anzacs, that's 1978. And the War Memorial Act of 1980 really changed things. So, 1974 is a rough marker. But if you compare the way it is now to the way it was then, clearly massive amounts of books are coming out, massive numbers. Although I calculated somewhat fewer numbers of books each year than we had about 10 years ago. So we may have seen, if you like, peak Anzac. And that's clearly influenced by all sorts of things. It's influenced by the state of the economy, by who gives out grants. That the War Memorial Grant Scheme, which then died, and then the Army History Unit took it up. I think you've had an Army History grant or two. I hope so, anyway. But they're the sort of things that influence. Yeah, good. Glad to see the money, spending money wisely. But they're the sort of things which influence how people do. Because military history in this country is not as easy as it looks. I mean, you don't live in Canberra. If you lived in Canberra, you've got all of the War Memorial at the moment is in a dark place because it's not, you can't order documents inside a month. So it's really hard to do it in Canberra. But normally, when the War Memorial is running properly, in Canberra, it's very easy to do military history because a lot of the official and private sources are here. But if you live in Broome or Townsville or, Hobart, it's not as easy as that. So it's although military history is a really important part of our national culture, it's not necessarily something that gets done, at the drop of a hat. It requires people to, as you know, to put effort in, to put their own money in, to then persuade a publisher to publish it, and then to work hard to get people to notice the book. So it's an important part of Australia's history. It's not the only part. I mean, there's lots of other things in Australia's history that we should be interested in. But there's no doubt at all, and the torrent of books suggests that it is a major part of this country's historical experience, and we should be reading those books, and we should be thinking about it and talking about it, as we are, Matt.
When it comes to weight loss, no two people are the same. That's why Noom builds personalized plans based on your unique psychology and biology. Take Brittany. After years of unsustainable diets, Noom helped her lose 20 pounds and keep it off.
I was definitely in a yo-yo cycle for years of just losing weight, gaining weight, and it was exhausting.
And Stephanie. She's a former D1 athlete who knew she couldn't out-train her diet, and she lost 38 pounds.
My relationship to food before Noom was never consistent.
And Evan, he can't stand salads, but he still lost 50 pounds with Noom.
I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. Even through the pickiness, Noom taught me that building better habits builds a healthier lifestyle. I'm not doing this to get to a number. I'm doing this to feel better.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom users compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at Progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Well, it's an interesting point, Peter, and I'd be interested to know your feeling about the balance between military history and other parts of Australian history, because I know it's something that historians have been talking about for a long time, that it's an interesting story, but there's a lot more to Australia's story than just military history. But I find even on this podcast or this YouTube channel that it's called Living History. We talk about history in general, but it's military history that really engages Australians. So just give me your opinion about that, about this Australian... This seeming Australian feeling that most of our history can be told through the story of conflict.
Yeah, that's right. And of course it can't. There are huge swathes of Australian history that have nothing to do with war. The thing about Anzac is such an important part of the national identity that it's resulted in a lot of the relevant records being made available, digitized. I mean, think of the National Archives, which digitized every single military record for both world wars. So if you're doing family history, and that's a really important aspect, it's so easy to deal with the military aspects of family history and really hard to do some other bits because there aren't official records. You know, the official records in this country are freely available and they give you a framework that you can work everything else in the story into. So it's in some ways it's a bit unbalanced. So we don't do even family history. Spending years on a fruit block on the Murray doesn't generate records because there's no officers or sergeants to write your war diary up. So lots of things go undocumented. But Australia has a very strong record of bureaucratic military record keeping, which means that we've got the records. And I mean, I, for one, have built a career on them, so I'm certainly not complaining. But I think it is true that we tend to overemphasize the military, partly because it's easy, partly because it's exciting, and partly because it's really interesting.
On the subject of how we're writing about military history and how we're telling this story, I sometimes struggle as a person trying to tell these stories to break through the myths and to try and paint the story in something more than two dimensions. And I know this is something you're very focused on. You were a big part of Honest History that around the time of the centenary was trying to redress some of these myths. I mean, you've used the term Anzacery. I don't know if you coined that term, but the two-dimensional obsession that we have with the story of Anzac at every level, the members of the public, politicians, institutions, a lot of the time. Talk to me a little bit about that and where you feel we are in terms of an honest connection with our Anzac history in 2024.
Yeah. Some years ago, I used to work at the War Memorial, and one of the things we did there in the early 2000s, we commissioned a social survey company to do a survey of what visitors to the War Memorial wanted. And we discovered that a large slice of visitors to the War Memorial wanted there to be toilets because they were tourists and they needed a place to go. And another large slice were people who wanted to basically feel proud of being Australian. They were the people that didn't want to hear the truth necessarily. They wanted to hear good stories, positive stories, proud stories. Very, maybe 40% probably. And then there was another big slice, probably about 25%. And the social research company called these people truth seekers, because these people didn't care whether the the story was, about heroism or glory or national pride. They wanted to know what it was like. And they thought that museums, and especially the War Memorial, was able to tell it like it was. And so I think there's a very large. It's very easy to big note Australian military history. There's a lot of successes. There's a lot of medals being awarded, a lot of heroes. It's very easy to boost that. But there is a very substantial part of the community that says, look, don't give me the patriotic bull. Just tell me what it was like. I want the truth. And Australia's got enough military historians to be able to do that. I've got to say, too, that there's another large chunk of Australian people who aren't interested at all in military history. And they're typically people who've come from a country, overseas. They have no connection with Australia's military past. And to them, they're not sure why the 25th of April is a particularly important day. So we've got to recognize that the story you hear from popular writers and from the press and the media and politicians, as you say, isn't the only way to talk about Australian military history. But there are lots of people who want to know the real story.
Well, that ties neatly to what I think was one of the most interesting chapters in your book, which is the discussion about the so-called storians as opposed to the historians, the popular writers who are taking subjects and writing books about them to various levels of quality. Talk to me a little bit about that. Obviously Peter Fitzsimons is the standard bearer for this movement. Talk to me about the role of storians versus more academic historians, and just how you see the results of their work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I have to say that I wouldn't want to say all popular history is bunk. That's not what I'm saying in this book or here, because there are a lot of good popular historians, and you're one of them. Peter Rees is one of them. Paul Daly's one of them. There's a raft of people that I could point the finger at and say, you're not an academic, but you write good military history. So let's be clear about that. At the same time, the storian movement, and it really goes back to Les Carlyon, his book Gallipoli, 2001. That was, I think, the beginning of the storian movement. It's odd, though, because when you think, what unites all the storians? And the answer is that most of them have been journalists at some point in their career. Most of them are still journalists. So, and I think what happened was that about the middle 90s, late 1990s, publishers started to realize that, or may possibly bought the idea from journalists, that journalists could tell a story. And they also bought the idea that, if you like, academic historians couldn't tell a story to save their lives. And these became accepted as fact. And of course, neither is true, because you can find journalists who couldn't tell a decent historical story to save their lives. And you can find a lot of historians who write really good history, readable history. So I think what's happened is that and this is all driven by the market, of course, because if you take a popular writer like Les Carlyon, like Peter Fitzsimons, writers who are already known in the marketplace, because it is a marketplace, then of course publishers will see that they've got an economic advantage by getting a well-known writer to do what they're known to do very well. And so that's where we saw the rise of the storians. And there's a whole identifiable school of them. Roland Perry is one of them. There are many others. Now, and not necessarily all that they write is nonsense. But the problem was that what is history? Among other things, history is a discipline. And a discipline is marked by people, if you like, putting boundaries around what they do. For example, proper historians will say, I don't make stuff up. I follow where the evidence goes. Well, historians don't necessarily follow that rule. So Peter Fitzsimons, for example, in the introductions and the forwards to his books, quite openly says, I make stuff up. I change things to make it a better story. Now, you might think that that's good as entertainment. If I'm just publishing a novel next year. There's the cover. I make stuff up too, but it's within a book called a novel. It's fiction, and I try and separate the fiction from the history. And I don't think the storians pay enough attention to the sorts of things that people like you and I take as the guardrails to write about the past. So that's the root of my unease with the storians. And I think one of the consequences of that is that people, if you like, don't really know. It's like McDonald's. Lots of people eat McDonald's and fast foods. And I like a bag of chips, but I don't think a bag of chips is going to keep me alive forever. I need other nutrition. I need other things to nourish me. And the problem with the storians is that they're too much like McDonald's. They might be satisfying in the short term, but they're not nourishing in the long term. And I think that's a bad thing for our historical nutrition.
It's been suggested to me that perhaps some of these books that get a large audience and they're not quite as accurate as they should be, but perhaps they introduce a topic to people who otherwise wouldn't read about it. And the hope is that those people then go out and do some more scholarly research. Do you think that's the case?
It is often said. I've had people say it to me as well. But I say if they're going to go out and read a book, why don't they read a decent book? It's like saying McDonald's is great because it introduces people to the concept of eating the potato. And I say, well, let's go and eat a really good potato, a real nourishing potato cooked in a healthy way. And that, I think, is the difference.
I think the other issue too, is you touched on this, but it's the idea that historians can't tell a good story. There are so many amazing PhD theses just sitting on shelves that can't get out there because they can't be pitched in a way that is going to be considered commercial by publishers. So there are so many amazing Australian history stories that get read by 100 people. And sometimes you just crave wanting this information to get out there, and you imagine what a difference it would make if people knew this chapter of the story or this different angle on the Anzacs. And if we're continually obsessed with just the next bestseller, or I'm guilty of it myself, the forgotten battle and all these angles that we take to sell books, how much quality material are we missing out on?
Yeah, that's right. Mind you, in justice, when was the last book about Krithia, Matt? And I would say that it's been, it's 1922. It's probably 102 years is probably a fair time to wait for the next book about Krithia. So, but you're right, though. I mean, I know people who've written PhDs and have published them themselves because they couldn't attract a publisher. And then the book has gone on to win prizes. Now, what does that tell you about the judgment of the Australian publishing industry? What are they valuing? What are they looking for? And can you trust that? I'm accepting New South's editors from this condemnation, of course, but you're right though. Good stuff gets written, and not all the good stuff gets published, and that is a great frustration for us.
Bada boom, sold.
Huh?
Just sold my car on Carvana. Dropping it off and getting paid today.
Already?
What, you still haven't sold yours? You told me about it months ago.
Is
the offer good?
Oh, the offer's great.
Don't have another car yet?
I could trade it in for this car I love.
Come on, what are we waiting for?
You're right.
Let's go.
Whether you're looking to sell your car right now or just whenever feels right, go to Carvana.com and sell your car the convenient way. Terms and conditions apply.
Hey, I'm Ryan Reynolds. At Mint Mobile, we like to do the opposite of what Big Wireless does. They charge you a lot, we charge you a little. So naturally, when they announced they'd be raising their prices due to inflation, we decided to deflate our prices due to not hating you. That's right. We're cutting the price of Mint Unlimited from $30 a month to just $15 a month. Give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
$45 upfront payment equivalent to $15 per month. New customers on first 3-month plan only. Taxes and fees extra. Speed slower above 40 gigabytes. See details.
I'd also suggest when we talk about perhaps these more popular, broader books introduce people to the topic, I don't necessarily think that's the case. I think if someone, and not to denigrate particular authors, but using Fitzsimons as an example, if someone reads a Fitzsimons book, they're simply waiting for the next Fitzsimons book to come out on whatever subject that may be. I don't think they're now going to their library or to the War Memorial to dig deeper into the story of Tobruk or Kokoda. So, there's probably some hypocrisy here because I'm potentially halfway in the middle. I'm certainly not an academic historian, but I'm not a journalist either. And, I try to tell a good story, but at the same time, you want to get that message out there. So you've got to write it in a way that is exciting to the public and does push all those buttons. It's not an easy balance.
No, it's not. No. Yeah, it's not an easy balance. And I'd also say that you use the word if people read a Fitzsimons book. And one of the things that I'm really down on is just the length of the Storians books, because I don't think a lot of people do get to the end of Tobruk. Tobruk to me is 2.5 times longer than a PhD. I think you can tell a good historical story in less than 100,000 words. 80,000 words. Ian Bowring at Allen and Unwin used to say that 80,000 words was the sweet spot. And I've certainly taken that advice. I've also just published a book of 170,000 words, I admit, but most of my books are less than 100,000 words. And I think that's the thing. People who write books about history need to be thinking about the people who want to read books about history and not just indulge themselves with, writing as much as they'd like to write. It's just too self-indulgent.
Putting this book together, Peter, what did it reveal to you about Australia's preoccupations? Are there certain chapters of military history that stand out as having an overabundance of books, and are there other areas where you see there's gaps in the storytelling?
Yeah, I certainly did. The thing that really struck me was that there are whole fields in Australian history now that simply didn't exist 50 years ago. For example, the whole business about not just POWs, but the effect of war on POWs, the effect of war on people generally. There wasn't even a book on Australian war memorials 50 years ago. And then Ken Inglis came along and wrote Sacred Places and, opened our eyes to it. But also the effects of war too is one I think will get bigger because people are now thinking not just about the experience of war, and the Veterans Royal Commission has opened our eyes on that score too. People are thinking about what serving in uniform, and especially going to war in uniform or being involved in a war, what that does to people. And of course, because we're a bureaucratic nation, there are whole warehouses full of repat records. Next week, I'll be going to Melbourne to look at repat records for a group of survivors of the Great War for my next book. And they document, 50 or 60 years of these men's lives after they were wounded in the Great War. And our focus up till now has been the 4 years that they spend at war. Well, there's an awful lot of their lives and their families' lives that go after that. So I think that's one of the areas, or that's one of the phenomena in Australian military history, that the field is expanding, not just because we have more wars, but it's expanding because we're asking more questions. We're writing books that couldn't have been written years before. Because, for example, frontier conflict, we didn't even know there was such a thing. It didn't even have a name in 1974. And now it's one of the most busy aspects of Australian history because we've realized that this thing happened and now we want to understand it. So people write books. And that's surely going to continue.
What are the areas that you think have got too many books written about them?
Well, it might surprise you, Matt, but I don't think any aspect has got too many books about it, because more books might mean, some books will be written about, for example, Damien Wright's just done a book about Australians in North Russia in 1919. Now, there have been already at least 2 and maybe 3 books on that subject, but Damien Wright's book is pretty good. He wrote a fantastic book about the aftermath of the First World War in Central Asia a few years ago. An Australian writing from Adelaide. So I would never say, don't do that. I would say, do it, but do it in a way that tells us something new, or that asks questions about this experience that we all thought we knew about, and we really didn't, because you come along and you find records, or you look at those records in a new way, or you tell the story from a different angle, and bingo, something that used to be boring and familiar all of a sudden is new. So, no, I don't think, I wouldn't discourage anyone from writing, but I would try and nudge them towards doing some things rather than other things. But no, let's see more and more.
Well, it might be like asking you to choose, the favourite of your children. But out of these 1,000 books that you've discovered, what are the half dozen? Let's put it in some sort of context. If someone was saying, "I've enjoyed hearing this conversation, I want to go out and learn more,"
Yep.
what are the half dozen or so books you'd say, here's a must-read?
Yeah, that's the easiest question in the last half hour, Matt, because my list is The Broken Years has got to be number one because it is the pathbreaker. I mentioned Ken Inglis's Sacred Places. That's number two. Jeff Gray's Military History of Australia, which came out in 3 editions, 1990 and then some other day, and then 2008. Poor Jeff died 8 years ago, but his book lives, and his book is a fabulous summary of that really important aspect of Australian history. I mentioned Carolyn Holbrook's Anzac, an Unauthorized Biography, and it's really good. If you want to understand Anzac, it's a good place to begin. And the last one on my list...
It's a great title, too.
It is a fantastic title. When somebody pinches the best title, you think, I wish I'd thought of that. But the last book in that half dozen or 5 or whatever is Jared Windsor's book on the Vietnam War, All Day Long, The Noise of Battle. And I think it's one of the best books about a day of battle in Australia's military history, and not written by an historian, not written by an academic. He's a novelist, but he knows, and he's not a journalist, but he knew a good story, and he knew how to tell it. But there's lots of that. I mean, you could have the best. In the book, I nearly wrote a section with the best half dozen books in each category, if you like the Oscars. And that just started to make it too big. But I think you could easily do it because the field is so rich. We've got fabulous books on all aspects of military history in Australia. We don't know how lucky we are because not all countries do this.
If I asked you to look into your crystal ball, what does the future of military history writing look like in Australia?
Actually, that's a good question because one of my fears is that it won't be as busy and as rich as it's been. For example, we alluded to the fact that a lot of young historians can't get published. Now, if you can't get your first book published, you're not going to get your second book published. In fact, you're never going to write your second book. So that's a real worry that there are young historians, and they are our future. People like me, we're still writing, but the future, the young people should be writing. It's harder for them to write. It's harder for them to find the time to write. So I think that's one of my worries. But on the other hand, when I came to do the index to the book, I realized that I knew several hundred military historians in this country. Some of them are dead now, but most of them are alive and kicking, and most of them are still writing. So that's a cause for optimism. So I think we're never going to see the end of Australian military history. It may change character, it may change pace. We may not see as much, but I think it's always going to be a part of our nation's history, and I hope it's always going to be a part of the books that we take off the shelf.
Well, this is certainly a great addition to the list of fantastic military history books. I don't want to say the wrong thing here, but I was surprised by how much I enjoyed this. It was such it was a really engaging take on the subject. I wouldn't have thought it was my typical go-to, but I really enjoyed it, so I strongly recommend it. You mentioned several projects you've got on the go. What are we going to see next from Peter Stanley?
Oh, okay. The next book I've got coming out is the biggest book I've ever written, which is called John Company's Armies, which is about the military forces of the East India Company and in India in the first half of the 19th century. So it's a bit esoteric, but about 10 years ago, Bill Gamage said to me, he said, you should write a big book. So there you go. I'm writing a big book. But the next Australian book is, apart from the novel, The Sharon, published by Big Sky next April. They just sent me the proofs yesterday, so it's hanging around here. I'm doing a book on the Alonville tragedy of 1918, when a shell came through the roof of a barn in, this, you've written about that. You've been there. You've been to Alonville. A shell came through the roof of that barn and killed about 27 men of the 14th Battalion and wounded about 50-odd others. And it's the most destructive shell in the AIF's history. And I thought, I've known about this for years, but I don't know much about it. So that's why I'm going to Melbourne to look up the repat records of the 50-odd survivors who were terribly wounded because it was a slate roof. The slates came down, they sliced off men's limbs and mutilated men. So I won't say I'm looking forward to going through those repat files, but that's going to be one of the core of the book is not just the events of the 31st of May 1918. It's going to be the lives of those men who lived with those injuries forevermore. So that's what I've got on the go at the moment.
Well, I can't wait to read that one. It is a great story, Allenville, and we often drive through it on a tour. And only a few years ago, there was someone on the tour whose relative had been either killed or wounded in that specific action. So it was a great reason to take the entire tour to that town to tell that story. It is a fascinating story. And Peter, I do have to say, it is what I love about your work, is that you take an angle of history, which is a good tale in and of itself, but then find a whole broader scope to tell a much bigger story. For example, with Men and Monson Quentin, I loved how you did that. You took a small action, a small number of men from the 21st Battalion, and told this much larger story about loss and remembrance and everything involved in that. And so I do think that is your fantastic skill as a historian, to take these small kernels and expand them into something bigger. So I'm really looking forward to that book. That'll be at the top of my list.
Great. Thanks, Matt.
We'll get you back on the podcast to discuss it. But in the meantime, the current book is Beyond the Broken Years, Australian Military History in 1,000 Books by Peter Stanley. It's out now. I thoroughly recommend you go and pick it up. It's a great read. And Peter, thank you for joining us to tell us this great story.
Oh, thank you, Matt. I really enjoyed our chat.
Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and leave a review for the podcast, and visit livinghistorytv.com for more great history content.
This episode is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. You chose to hit play on this podcast today. Smart choice. Make another smart choice with Auto Quote Explorer to compare rates from multiple car insurance companies all at once. Try it at progressive.com. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
On November 7th, Thundercat, Carasoft, and NVIDIA teamed up to host a discussion with leading government panelists to speak on best practices and challenges agencies are facing with AI. Learn how we can plan to navigate complex policy landscapes, assess agency needs, and contribute to shaping the future of AI applications in the government. You can now tune into the conversation on the Feds at the Edge podcast, streaming on all major platforms. Visit thundercattech.com/events for more info. That's thundercattech.com/events.
Imagine what's possible when learning doesn't get in the way of life. At Capella University, our game-changing FlexPath learning format lets you set your own deadlines so you can learn at a time and pace that works for you. It's an education you can tailor to your schedule. That means you don't have to put your life on hold to pursue your professional goals. Instead, enjoy learning your way and earn your degree without missing a beat. A different future is closer than you think with Capella University. Learn more at capella.edu.
Hello, it's Matt McLachlan. Before we get to this week's podcast, I wanted to extend a very special invitation to you. In August 2025, my signature tour is heading back to the Western Front, and I'd love you to come with me. We're going to explore the battlefields of France and Belgium and tell the entire story of the Australians during the First World War. It's going to be an amazing trip. We're going to visit the Somme, we're going to visit the Ypres Salient, French Flanders, famous battlefields such as Passchendaele, Pozières, Villers-Bretonneux, Bullecourt, Fromelles, and many more. Now, this is the only tour I'm going to personally escort to the Western Front in 2025. So if you'd like to come with me, please don't wait. The tour sells out very, very quickly. It departs Paris on the 30th of August, 2025, and you can find full information at our website, which is battlefields.com.au.